Hey everybody, how's it going? Corey here from Themeco with a video on how to build sliders in WordPress, specifically using our Cornerstone Page Builder plugin. Now, one of the things that we're most excited about with this release cycle is the fact that these sliders are completely native to Cornerstone. They've been styled and scripted from scratch, so there's no cruft or third-party code that you're going to be fighting when implementing these into your designs and your websites. Now, before we jump into the elements and the features and all of that, I want to take just a moment to talk about the philosophy that we kind of use to approach sliders in Cornerstone. And there's a specific word that I want you to kind of keep top of mind as we work through these examples, and that word is deconstruction. As we were doing our research at the beginning of this release cycle, it became evident to us pretty early on that there was really no way the concept of sliders in general could just be approached with some sort of basic element like text or a headline or anything like that with a couple simple options. There's just so many factors at play when designing a slider. For example, do you need it to loop infinitely? Do you want it to have a stacked or kind of an inline appearance where the slides are coming in from the side of the screen? Do you want your slides to be equal height, variable height? Do you need touch interactions? Do you want additive styles that you can put onto active slides that are currently focused? The list of potential desires just goes on and on and on. So the way we've done that is we've really broken down the idea of a slider into its constituent parts, which you can see if I go up to my element library here. You'll see that we've got some elements up here in our standard grouping. So there are three core elements you're going to use if you're truly building a slider from scratch, and that is the slide container, which you can really think of as sort of an analog to the row or the grid. It's the parent element that's required for you to add individual slides to your design later on. Next, we have our slide navigation element, which is actually a little prefab element we've created. Prefab is more a term we use internally, but all it really means is that it's sort of a bundled element that contains other basic elements from the library that you already use all the time, such as divs or icons or things like that. So the slide navigation is basically a div with two more divs inside it serving as a previous and next button. And this will allow you to quickly navigate through your slider one page at a time. Now, the cool thing about this that we'll talk about later is there's actually some systems we've implemented where you can basically turn anything on your page into a previous or next button. So you're not beholden to having to use some type of div or button to navigate between your slides. There's a lot of flexibility there, but this just serves as a quick start point for you to drag in that just works and can get you up and running. And then finally, we have slide pagination, which is basically the little dots you might see typically on a slider that you've come across in the wild. It's got some really fun options for styling. It's very flexible. You can get a lot of cool looks out of it. But the most important thing to note about this element is that it is dynamically generated and it responds to your settings as your slider moves and changes across different viewports. So, for example, the number of dots shown in the slide pagination will automatically increase or decrease as the number of slides shown in your container per viewport might go up or down based on the settings that you've applied. So all of this is well and good, but we also know that it's important to have some really quick on-ramps for people to just get up and running as quickly as possible just so they can see things working and start designing right away. And that's why we have also included these two basic slider elements here, the slider inline and slider stacked prefab elements. And what you'll get anytime you drag one of these elements in is basically the whole picture of a working slider wired up for you, ready to go. It will contain the slide container with a few slides in it, a slightly altered slide navigation, and a slide pagination element. So let's just see how that works by adding it to our page here. I'm going to go to my section, open this up, I'll search for slider, and we'll start with our slider inline element. And you can see that indeed, right out of the gate, we've got a slider element working here. We've got our individual slides here that you can click on and inspect and start styling right away. We have our pagination element down here, which we can click and move to our next page in the slider. And we've also got our working navigation elements here. So I can click the previous button here, for example, and it will take me back to that first page. Now remember, these are just normal elements that you use every day when building your pages in Cornerstone. So for example, this previous button is just a div that basically has a special custom attribute applied to it called data-x-slide-prev. which just tells our slider library that, hey, this button is intended to be a previous button for the slider. So when I click it, it should always be going back a page in my content. As I mentioned earlier, you can apply this to practically any element on your page and turn anything into a previous button. And of course, the next button has its own custom attribute, data-x-slide-next. For these basic out-of-the-box sliders, they are basically set up with a div as the parent element. You can see that right here. And that has some very basic styling applied. And then the direct children are the pagination element. And then another div serving as a content wrapper for both our slide container and our slide navigation. Now, the reason why we did this is because as you start adding content to your slides, the height of that slide container is going to grow and shrink accordingly. And since for this particular look, we were just going for a simple kind of centered navigation that you typically see on most sliders, we put that wrapping div around all the content. And then our slide navigation here is, again, just another div that we've positioned absolutely. It's 50% from the top. It's spreading all the way from right to left. And then we're doing a simple CSS transform to translate it back up 50% of its height. And so that's what's ensuring that this navigation element here is vertically centered over your content. We're also using the no pointer events option here on only that parent div. So even though you can see that this div is spanning over your content, it won't interfere with any click events on the content of your slides. But these buttons do, of course, work. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the great thing about all of these pieces here is that they are elements that you already know from the element library when building out your pages in Cornerstone. So, for example, if I wanted this button to not be circular, but instead rounded, I can simply click on that button, move down to my design section, find the border radius, and perhaps I'll give it a simple 1em value for those rounded corners. And I can, of course, do the same thing on my next button. And very quickly, we're already starting to kind of alter the style and feel of our slider. So now that we've talked a little bit about the markup breakdown of these basic slider elements, let's dig into our actual slide container and take a look at what is available for us when building out our sliders. Now, as we mentioned earlier, you can think of the slide container element as a layout element, kind of like the row or the grid. It's a required parent that you're going to add first so that you can then later apply your slides to your designs. You'll see right here we've got our children's sortable, similar to our row or grid, and it's very easy to add new slides from scratch or simply duplicate one and then go from there. We've got a pretty straightforward but very powerful set of options here that you can use to configure the functionality of your slider. This is broken down into our basic setup box, which we see on most elements. Then we have a grouping of controls for layout, which deals primarily with the functional kind of look and feel of your slider. Next, we have a group of controls called options, which deal primarily with the way your slider is intended to operate. So for example, do I want this slider to autoplay? Maybe it increments automatically to the next slide every 5 seconds or so. Do I want this slider to loop infinitely and have kind of a carousel feel to it, etc., etc. So all of those controls can be found there under options. Next, we've got our content sizing control group. And again, this is kind of similar to features you see on the row or grid where you can add a container to any of those elements that matches your theme option settings. But the primary difference here is that this control relates to the interior content of your slide container and not the slide container itself. So you'll notice that even though we've got this global container on here, our slide container is spanning the entire width of our viewport. And that's because as of right now, this slide container is a direct child of the section effectively. So it has the room to spread out like that, like it needs. But you'll notice that these 3 slides here in the middle are basically perfectly centered like we might expect a row or a grid to be if we had applied its global container option. So keep that in mind that this control is setting those dimensions here to contain these slides, and then our extra slides will kind of move beyond the bounds of that interior container. This can of course be disabled if you want, so if we turn that off by default, it's going to be 100% wide. And you can now see how those slides are spanning that content. But I could, of course, alter this if I wanted to maybe give it a max width here, and you'll see how these slides come in. And now I've got this 800 pixel container here that's kind of defining the size of how these interior slides should operate. So lots of cool options there, and we're really going to talk about that in a little bit more detail later. Finally, we've got our design control group, which only contains a padding control, which is a little different from the row or grid, which usually have margin and box shadow and border and all sorts of other things you can style it with. But because of how involved the slide container was with all these options, we didn't want to overwhelm too much with any additional options that weren't necessary, especially due to the fact that now with the div element or other layout elements like the row or the grid, you can always put this slide container inside one of those elements, and you can put any of the sort of aesthetic changes you want to make onto that element. So for example, you might want to put a black border with a rounded border radius on a div as a parent, and then put the slide container inside that, and that div can serve as sort of the visual container to the slide itself. Now this padding here is applied to the viewport of your slider. And what is the viewport, I hear you asking? Well, the viewport is just basically the container that serves as the kind of base level markup for your slides. Now we included this control for a very specific reason, and it kind of takes me to the first technical piece of knowledge we need to understand about sliders, which is the fact that by default, this slide container is always set to overflow hidden. Now why is that? Well, the basic reason is that, especially when using these inline sliders, you'll notice that the slides that are outside of our current content keep scrolling off to the edge here. They're basically outside the viewport of the browser. Now by default, this could potentially trigger a horizontal scroll bar, which is mostly undesirable when working on our designs. So putting this overflow hidden control here ensures that our container is always going to be sort of chopping off anything that is extending beyond the bounds of that element, and it's going to make sure that we don't get those horizontal scroll bars when we don't want them. However, there's a problem with this. What if, for example, we didn't want to have a simple kind of flat look here, but instead, maybe we wanted our slide to have a white background, and then to see the boundary of that slide, let's say I wanted to give it a box shadow. You'll notice that now that we've done this, not only is that overflow hidden option chopping off the slides over here, ensuring that we don't get those horizontal scroll bars, but it's basically chopping off anything that might visually extend beyond the bounds of that slide container. So this presents a bit of a problem here because obviously you might not want the shadow to be cut off like this. And this is precisely why we've included this padding control on the slide container. So if I did have a situation like this where visually I needed some content to not be cut off like this, I could easily adjust the padding value for, say, the bottom of the viewport, and you'll see that now I don't have that shadow appearing to be cut off anymore. Now the one trick about doing this is that you are of course adding some more dimension to your slide container that you might not want. You might not want that extra padding pushing all your content away like you can see here. So I'm going to set this back to 0, and we're going to jump back up to our setup control group here and show that this is precisely why we've included this overflow option right here. While it is set to hidden by default, you can set it to visible and see that we can allow those shadows to extend beyond the bounds of our container without needing to add any extra padding to the viewport and push content away in a manner that we don't want. Now, the one consideration to keep in mind when doing this is that, again, you could potentially trigger a horizontal scroll bar since we're not cutting off our content anymore like this. So in a scenario like this, we would always recommend that perhaps you go up to at least the parent section that's around your slider and set its overflow option to hidden. And what this will do is basically just ensure that instead of the slide container operating as the boundary that no content should go beyond, now the section is operating in that manner. So for a scenario like this, we can allow our shadow to escape the bounds of the slide container like we need it to, but we can also ensure that our section is doing its job by keeping this content that's moving off the side of the screen from triggering any undesirable scroll bars. So as you can see, it's super easy to jump right in, start adding elements, start clicking on slides, start changing the style. And you'll notice that all of these slides are individually stylable by default. So we could, for example, click on this slide and maybe change it to a different color if that's what we wanted. You have the flexibility to independently style these if you so desire. However, let's say we've made some changes to a slide like this, and now we want it to be reflected across all of the slides within our slider. Well, my favorite way to do this is simply make the changes I want to one slide, and then I'll right-click on it, which will bring up the context menu here. And I'm going to click on this copy action. And you can also use the keyboard shortcut that you see here. Next, I can go down to my breadcrumbs, and really I just need to go up to any parent of these slides. I can right click on that, and you'll see that we've got two options here for paste slide and paste slide style. Now, paste slide essentially means that I'm going to copy the style and the content of the slide that I just copied. So for example, since this slide says slide 1, all of these slides would reference that slide 1 copy across the board. However, I don't want to do that. All I want to do is apply the style that I copied from that slide. And that's where we would click this paste slide style option. And once you do that, you'll see that that style is automatically applied to all of your slides, and it's very simple to make a couple minor adjustments and then apply it throughout. Now, if you truly wanted to build a slider from scratch, it's as simple as going to your section. I'm just going to delete my inline slider here. I'm going to go up to my add an element option here, and we can see slide container right down here in the list. So if I click on that, I'll see our familiar choose a layout screen that you're probably used to seeing on the row or the grid whenever you're working with a brand new element. And really all this is that we've got a couple quick start options here for you to get up and running without a whole lot of fuss. So if I click on, for example, the 3 slides per page option here, what it's done is set up an inline slider for me. Or let me open my layout options here, an inline slider. It has automatically added 6 slides for me. We can kind of see those moving off the side of the screen. And I can start clicking right into these and adding elements and styling as I want. And then let's say that I also knew I wanted to add a navigation element here. I could again go back to my section and simply add this slide navigation element. And you're going to see just a very basic styled set of buttons appear for you to start working on. Again, the whole point of this is that all of the navigational stuff is wired up for you. You've got a little bit of design so you can see something, but you can click right on this. We'll see that the slider is automatically moving, and I could of course start styling these buttons as I see fit. There's a little bit of nuance to these navigational elements, which we cover in much more detail in the docs, but the really cool thing about them is that they basically just work. You'll notice as I placed it into my section here and I started clicking on this button, my slides have automatically started progressing through the slider. And that's because we've designed these elements in such a way that they will look through your markup, try to find the most closely associated slider that it thinks it should be operating on, and control that when necessary. So out of the box, you don't have to worry about the fuss of wiring things up or getting things functional. It should all just work as you drag these elements into your preview, and it's just up to you to start designing and adding your content. Now, as I mentioned, there are a few nuances to this that you might want to tweak based on some much more advanced examples, but all of that is covered in the docs. So if you've got an idea for a slider that you're trying to accomplish that feels a little bit outside the bounds of what you're seeing here, definitely check that information out when you have a chance. All right, so now that we've discussed the base elements in the element library of building our sliders from scratch, and also the prefab sliders we've got included, let's set up an example here that has a little bit more style to it, some content, maybe a little bit more of a real-world scenario, and let's start working through our layout and option controls on our slide container. All right, so here's our super simple example slider that I've set up for us to kind of look at a couple other options here. And one quick side note about this slider, which I'm sure some of our power users are already asking about, is the fact that this slider is set up with a looper. You'll notice if I go up to my containing element here, we can see that I've got a looper provider turned on. And basically, I've just got some custom JSON data that I've set up. Basically, a name, a testimonial, and an image for me to work with. And for me personally, this is one of my favorite ways to work with sliders because I can set up any sort of data that I want in here and then loop through that, but only have to design my content once. So since all of these slides are linked through the looper, as I make any style or layout changes, all of that is going to be immediately reflected throughout all of the slides in my content. Another quick side note about loopers in general with this release is we've changed a little bit about how their appearance functions. For example, in previous releases, anything that was a virtual element or something created by a looper, it was typically turned grayscale and then had some opacity applied to it, which works great for static single instances of a looper. But once you start nesting loopers within loopers, or you have situations like this with sliders and maybe you're even stacking some things, it can start to get a little hard to track that content. Additionally, you weren't able to click on those virtual elements in previous release cycles, but now anything that is a virtualized element will be represented by this black observer with that kind of striped diagonal line icon there. And all that's really doing is telling you, hey, this is a virtual copy of a core element somewhere else in your looper. But the great thing about it is that I can still click on this element just like I would the core element here in my looper setup. All right, so let's talk about layout options. All right, so let's talk about layout controls. The first main fork in the road that you're going to meet when working on your sliders is deciding if you want things to be laid out in an inline fashion, which is what we've been kind of exploring so far, where you've got a couple slides here perhaps, and then the remaining slides in your slide container are just kind of in a line flowing off the edge of the screen there. This is great when you want to see that lateral movement happening, or perhaps you want to set up some type of infinite looping carousel later on. There's lots of fun stuff to explore in that scenario. The other main layout type we have is stacked, which you can see when I go to stacked, we lose pretty much all of our layout options, which we'll talk about in just a moment here, and we get a different set of option controls down here. Now just to start, we're going to work through our inline options in both the layout and the options control group, and then we will circle back around to our stacked layout and talk about those. So our inline sliders center around the idea of pages. And for the most part, I would recommend if you're using an inline slider to stick to this paged mode. We do have an auto mode here, which basically means that instead of setting these sort of equal width slides automatically for you, the sizing of each one of your slides will be determined by its own content. Really, this scenario is best for situations where perhaps you've got an image carousel of logos you wanted to display. And if you think of just some common logos that might pop in your head, like Nike versus Apple, obviously some of those logos are wider, some are taller, they come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. And maybe we want our slider to kind of move with the width of that content directly. So you can do that if you want. It requires just a little bit more setup, but I do think that for the most part, this paged option is where most people will find they can get a lot done quickly and easily, because it also kind of taps into some paradigms that we use in other elements. For example, you'll notice that currently we've got our page slider set up to show 2 slides per page. And let's say we had a row right above this that was showing 2 columns, and it also had a 1 gap between its content. The really cool thing here is that you can get a visually cohesive look going through your content. So you might see your columns lining up directly with these slides, but now I've got this slider here where I'm able to bring in some horizontal movement and showcase my content in a slightly different way, but it still feels really cohesive across the board. So as we just talked about, with this number per page option, we can determine how many slides we want to show per page in our slider. So for example, I could increase this to 3, and you'll now notice that I've got 3 slides showing up in my main content here for my slider. Again, the size of that content is determined by our content sizing control down here, which currently has our global container turned on. Now, the really cool thing about number per page is that it's responsive. You can see this since the label is highlighted when I'm hovering over it. And this is great because while 3 slides looks pretty good right here on my large breakpoint, even as I start getting down to medium, things start getting pretty scrunched here. And I can already tell that it's not going to look great as we get much smaller. So we can remedy this by going to our number per page option, opening up our responsive controls, and I'm going to change this to 2. And we can see that a couple different things happened here. Firstly, we're showing our 2 slides per page now that we've defined in our option, but the other cool thing is that our pagination is automatically updated. We've got 5 slides in this slider, so when we were showing 3 slides per page, we only saw 2 dots down here because we had 3 on our first page and 2 on our second page. Now that we're showing 2 slides per page, we've got 3 dots representing 2, 2, and then 1 for our final page in our slider. All right, so let's see how that looks on small. And again, I think that's looking pretty scrunched. So what I might do here is click back into my slide container, open up my responsive options, and perhaps set it to 1 for small and then extra small. And now if we take a moment to look at our slider across all of our breakpoints, we can see on our extra large and large, we've got 3. On medium, we've got 2. And then on small and extra small, we're only showing 1. So this allows us to easily handle responsive layouts for particularly tricky situations like this with text where it pretty quickly starts wrapping and just doesn't look that great as it gets taller. We can accommodate that very easily, and also our other elements are in constant communication with our content and they know how to reflect their state appropriately. All right, so let's turn off our live preview here, and then I'm going to set my number per page back to 2. I'm just going to reset these. Next, we have our gap control, which is pretty straightforward. It's just the gap between our slides here. One really cool nuance to note about the gap control here is that you won't have any extra spacing off to the side here. Remember that these slides are contained by a global container from the far left edge of this slide to the far right edge of this slide. So watch those outer edges as I increase the gap here. You'll notice that those outer edges stayed stationary, but the interior gap between these two slides was the only thing that was adjusted. And it's also, of course, reflecting across the slider as a whole. So your layouts will remain very cohesive, very structurally sound. And then, of course, we could also adjust this control responsively if we so desired to accommodate our content across different viewports. All right, so next we come to the align control, which by default is set to stretch. And you can see that my slides are all equal height here. And this is one particularly important thing to note. The inline slider is powered by Flexbox, which allows us to take advantage of Flexbox's native alignment controls here. And when set to stretch by default like this, what it basically means is that all of our slides are going to be the same height, and they're basically going to match the height of the tallest slide in our content. And we can already see from our first slide here that this is at least one of the tallest slides in our content currently. And it's kind of defining the height for our other slides to follow here. The great thing about leveraging Flexbox in this way is that we're not using any hacky JavaScript to apply a fixed height or anything like that, like other slider libraries might do. This is all totally native and just works right out of the box. But we can also use this control to alter how these slides are aligned on that vertical axis. So for example, we could align them to the start, and you'll see that now my slightly shorter slide here has just been moved up a little bit, but we're aligned at that top edge. We could also align our content to the center, the end, or the baseline, which we're really not going to see much effect here because we've already styled it inside a box. But lots of really cool options to take advantage of there. Now, one side note here with this align control, you'll notice that when it is not set to stretch, we have this adaptive height control appear down here in our options. And basically what this means is if we set our slider to adaptive, it will change the height of the container based on the height of the currently most tall slide. So for example, on this page, that would be this slide. It's clearly the tallest one between these two, and it's sort of defining the height for this page. However, if I click to my second page here, you'll see that if I hover over my slide container, the container is now the exact height of these two slides because the tallest slide here is this one. And it, of course, moved my content up accordingly. Now, a quick note on this adaptive height control. It can be really cool for certain patterns, and particularly if you're only showing one slide at a time, and perhaps the content between those slides is just very different. There's a big disparity between those two. This might be something you want to explore in those scenarios, but do keep in mind that any content after this slider now is going to be moving up and down as the height of that slide container is adjusted via JavaScript. This can be particularly problematic if you enable autoplay, for example, because let's say you have your slider incrementing every 5 seconds to the next page. Well, if I'm really far down the page looking at some other content, it could appear like the page is just moving on me every 5 seconds and I can't track what I'm trying to read or engage with very easily. So do be aware that that option is available. It can be cool for certain situations, but we do encourage you to use it with caution. All right, so I'll set this back to stretch, and then we're going to talk about the justify control here. Now, to actually see this working, I'm going to have to make one more change down here in my options, and that is to change my scroll by option from content to slides. So by default, you've been seeing that as we move through this slider, we're moving by the number of slides on that page each time. So since I've got it set to 2, every time I click a navigation button or my pagination, it's moving by 2 slides. Basically, the whole width of our content there. However, we can have a paged slider setup, but then only scroll by 1 slide at a time. So what this does is it gives us the same structure that we had before using our 2 equal width slides here. But you'll notice that my pagination is already updated to show 5 dots now because we've got 5 slides in this slider. And of course, as I move through the slider now, you'll see that we're only progressing by 1 each time. So now that we only have 1 active slide that we're moving at a time, we can take advantage of this justify control, which basically takes any of the active slides you have and it can horizontally distribute them towards either the beginning, center, or end of your content. And really, for the most part, you might want to leverage this center option. So we can see now that our slide is still taking up the dimensions it took before when it was 2 by 2 to our page, because that overall layout is being set up here. But since I'm only moving by 1 slide at a time, I can now center that active slide in my slide container. And of course, as I navigate through my content, the newly active slide is going to take over that center position. Another really cool thing to do with this type of setup is maybe turn on a carousel, so you appear to have an infinite loop of content. So here's our first slide from before, but you can see that our 5th slide is now showing up over here. And basically, as I navigate through my content and I ultimately get to my 5th slide, when I navigate back to the first, it's just going to appear to continue to progress over in that rightward direction. Just something to be kind of aware of there. Lots of fun things we can play around with as we set up these options here. All right, so for now, I'm going to set this back to start. I'm going to turn off my carousel and then also set my scroll by option back to content. So this means that, again, we're basically moving by the page setup I've got here. And this brings me to the next option here, which is contain. Because you might have a situation like this, where you've got 2 slides per page, and as we move through our content, as we get to the last page, since we only have 1 slide, we end up with this kind of big blank space to the side here. Now, this is potentially undesirable. I think for the most part, most people would not want this, and an easy solution is just to make sure that your content kind of always matches up. So if we're moving by 2 slides at a time, maybe we only use 4 testimonials, right? But another fix that we have here is this contain option, which by default is set to ignore, which basically means that you're just going to move those slides over as they would naturally move while you navigate. However, if I select at edges, you'll see now I can go to my 2nd page, and then when I go to my 3rd page here, what it's going to do is take my single slide that I've got here and align it at the edge of my content. Of our slide container there. So kind of a subtle feature there, but definitely a useful one for situations like this. Next, I'm going to actually jump back to Autoplay here, where we've got 2 options for you. We've got a traditional interval autoplay, which if I turn this on, it would mean that every 5 seconds, the slider is going to progress to the next page with my content. Now, of course, we can adjust that duration if we want. It could be much quicker. Maybe we want to do 2 seconds at a time. And then we've also got this marquee option, which is effectively a linear continual scrolling option here. It basically operates by setting a speed control here, which could also be negative if you so desire, which effectively means it's going to move in the opposite direction here. We can increase that speed. And then, of course, if we wanted it to move on forever, we could turn on our carousel option here, and this would ensure that we never have any empty ends at either side of our slider. And the cool thing is, even if we've got that carousel option turned off, once it does reach the end of your content, it would effectively bounce back and move the other direction. So there's some really kind of sensible defaults based on how you want to use that, but some really cool options to explore there for sure. Next, we've got our interaction control, which is disabled by default, which basically means that there are no special interactions with these slides that you're performing. And that can be nice, for example, if you want the content in these slides on the front end of your website to be something that a user could maybe highlight and then copy and paste that content and put somewhere else if they need it. Next, we've got our click interaction, which basically means we can use the slides themselves as navigational elements in our sliders. So for example, if I turn this on and then I clicked on this slide over here, you would see that content center onto the second page because I'm clicking on that next page's content there. So that can be kind of a cool way to turn the slides themselves into navigational elements. And then of course we've got our drag interaction. So this is helpful if you want to support any type of pointer event or touch actions on mobile devices. And when you enable drag interactions, you'll also see this new scrolling control appear. I'm going to actually set this to slide really quick so we're only moving by one slide at a time. And you can see now as I drag this slide over and if I let it go, my next slide here basically snapped into place based on this option here. It aligned itself with where it should end up, meaning that we keep our kind of uniform 2x2 layout that we've defined using our pages. However, if you so desire, you can click this over to free scrolling, which effectively means if I take my slider here and I just flick it, my slides could end up anywhere. You'll see that nothing is aligned to that 2x2 grid anymore. This is particularly useful if perhaps you've got a looper setup of recent posts, and maybe you've got a slider that's just showing your recent posts off to the side, and you want people to flick through them more like they're scrolling rather than actually navigating some type of slider here. And then finally, we have our transition control, which is just the amount of time it takes to move from one set of current slides to the next. So we've been using 500 milliseconds, which is a pretty good time to use for the most part. However, we could click into our slide container and increase that dramatically. And now as I navigate through my content, you're going to see that it takes much longer for those slides to move into place. So purely a matter of personal preference and what you're going after. And you can also zero things out if you want for an instantaneous movement from one position to the other. All right, so let's quickly run through the stacked options, which are pretty straightforward. We've just got the one align control here for our stack slider. And again, it is by default set to stretch. So as we move through our slides here, you're going to see when we end up on a shorter slide that it's going to be matching the height of the rest of the content in our slider. Now the stack slider differs from the inline slider in that by default, it basically does a simple crossfade between your two slides. It's always only going to show you one slide at a time. So that's something to keep in mind when you're adjusting some of these parameters. For example, you'll notice if I click center here, it's not going to appear to do anything differently because this is one of my tallest slides in my content. However, once I get to that, I think it was my fourth slide, you'll see that now our content is visually centered in what is our entire slide container area. Also, you'll notice that since we've changed this from stretch, we've seen our adaptive height control pop back in here. So we could turn that on if we want and see again how this operates. So for example, as I move through these first three, nothing is going to appear to change. But then on that fourth one, we'll see that the slide container animates down to fit the height of that content. And then it's going to go back up to match this last slide here. Again, be careful how you use that control. It's very powerful and useful in some scenarios, but definitely not for everything. Next, instead of click or drag interactions, we've got our swipe control here, which allows you to define which axis a pointer event should move to trigger the progression of your slider. So for example, you might want somebody to only swipe on the x-axis, the y-axis, or both, because this is a multi-choose. And any of those operations can have your content move as you would expect. This can be really cool to use when you combine it with effects, which we'll talk about in a little bit here. You can create some cool things like the appearance of vertical scrolling, etc. Lots of fun stuff there. All right, now let me set this back to stretch really quick, and then we're going to talk about the entrance and exit effects here. By default, the stack slider is set up to use a crossfade, so you don't have to do any work. We will handle the opacity transition for you. And again, this works great for kind of a more classic slider feel. Perhaps you've just got some simple images you want to move through. Works great in that scenario. However, you can choose to use the effects module on your slides to manage the transitions between your content here. So to do that, we would move both of these over to effect. And by default, we're not going to see anything happen, but I'm going to need to go set something up on my effect module here by enabling my scroll effects, because we're basically just leveraging how this scroll effect works to transition from our entrance and exit state as we navigate from one slide to the next. All right, so what I've done here is, now that we're using an effect for both of our transitions, I've basically just set it up to use an animation for both, and we're going to do a back in left and then back out right for the exit. And you'll see that as I click from one slide to the next, we've got that content moving in and using those animations there. So tons of really fun options you can explore with those effects on your slides. You can, of course, use the transform option if you want instead. You can combine this with filters, with opacity to get lots of really cool different looks. But the main thing to keep in mind there is that you need to make sure that both your entrance and exit are set to effect. Now, you don't have to use both of these. For example, you might want to just have a simple fade exit while you have an effect entrance, and that's why we've broken these out. Also, if you set your exit to none, it effectively means that the previous slide, or the one that was the current slide, will just stay stationary, while perhaps a new slide appears to kind of slide in on top of it or do a cool zoom or rolling effect on top of it. There's lots of really fun stuff you can experiment with there. And then if you set your entrance to none, effectively what it will do is just have no transition at all between your slides. Clicking your navigation or pagination elements will just happen instantaneously. And it will hide these two controls for you as they're no longer needed. So just kind of a quick little way to have an instantaneous transition on those stack sliders. All right. So I want to take a moment to talk a little bit more about scroll effects and how they're integrated into our sliders, because we just touched on them a little bit for stacked mode, but there's some really cool stuff you can do with effects when designing your sliders. So as for this example here, I've got a paged inline slider. I'm showing 2 per page. I'm scrolling by slide. So again, that means I'm moving one slide at a time, and that's allowing me to use my justify control here so I can keep my currently active slide in the center here. And this is something to be aware of as you're working on your sliders and you're thinking about integrating some scroll effects like we're about to talk about here. The settings you have enabled will determine what is a current slide. And anything that is a current slide will effectively get the entrance state of your scroll effects if you've got them enabled on your slides. Conversely, anything that is not a current slide will get the exit scroll effects. Now, since I'm scrolling by slide, which means I'm only moving by one slide at a time, currently this center slide here is my active slide. It's the one that would get the entrance state once I enable this scroll effect here. And these slides to the side here that you're seeing, since I've got carousel enabled, those are not current slides. They're inactive, so they're going to get the exit state. Now, if I was scrolling by content, you would of course see these 2 slides move back over a little bit, and both of those slides would be the current slide. So just kind of be aware of that as you're working through this. And it's something that's much easier to see once you actually enable an effect, which we're going to do right now. Now remember, the slider I'm working on here is powered by a looper. So anything I change here is automatically applied to all of my slides. If you are building a slider completely from scratch and you're not using a looper and you're styling everything individually, you'll want to make sure you use that trick we talked about earlier, where maybe you change the look and feel and maybe the effects of your slide on one instance, and then copy and paste that style to the rest of the slides throughout your slider, just to ensure that everything is equal and operating as you would expect it to. So let's go to our effects module here. And actually, I'm not on the right element. Let me click on the slide, go to its effects module. And then I'm going to turn on the scroll transitions here, the scroll effects. And I've already got a little transform set up here that's basically doing a scaling effect on the inactive slides, so they're going to be a little bit smaller. And then it's also applying 2 filters. They're going to be grayscaled and then have their contrast reduced. So let's turn this on and see what happens. All right, so let's take a look at everything here. You'll notice that in our scroll effects, for our entrance style, we've got 1 as our opacity value, same for the exit. But like I mentioned earlier, our grayscale is set to 0, so full color, and then our contrast is set to 100%, so normal contrast. And then you can see in our transform box here that the scale is set to 1. And that's obviously what we're looking at here. This active option in the middle here is full size, full color, all that. However, our inactive slides to the side of our active one, those have been scaled down slightly, and they also have been given a full grayscale appearance here, in addition to having a reduced contrast, which is kind of having the text, image, all of that kind of blend into the background a little bit more. And if we check this transition out in real time, you can see something like this. Now again, what's happening is I've got my carousel mode on as well. So I've basically got infinite looping. So when I go to this next slide, it's basically going back to my first slide, but it just appears to be going on and on and on forever. I can, of course, also use my pagination to jump to a particular slide, and we'll see that effect transition. But hopefully this gives you some really cool ideas of just how much is possible by leveraging those scroll effects in addition to how you've set up the options for your slider. Before we wrap up here, I want to take just a moment to discuss some nuances about the content sizing control and some things to keep in mind as you're working on your designs, because there are a couple different ways to achieve a somewhat similar aesthetic result, but really functionally they're going to behave very differently. So let's talk about that right now. You can see here that I've got some outlines around my content, and you can turn these on at any point if you're just trying to debug something by adding this show outlines class to your slide container. Basically, the light blue is going to indicate the edges of your slider viewport, and then this pink outline is really defining the main content boundary for your slides. So for example, if I hop back to my slide container here, go down to my content sizing, we can see that by default we've got our global container turned on, and that is where this pink outline, our main content, is getting its size from. Now, since we're currently set up using a 3 slide per page configuration, you'll notice that I've got these kind of skinnier slides here, and that's really a function of the fact that these are basically 3 equal width columns, if you will, within our main content here. However, as we were talking about earlier, as I size my screen down, things are going to get pretty scrunched pretty quickly. And one way to get around this would, of course, be to change the number per page here. So I could go down to 2, and that would give me a little more wiggle room here on my medium breakpoint, but perhaps I don't want to change the number of slides per page in my slider. Perhaps what I'm really looking to do is kind of have a smaller slide dimension in general and have all my content move out from that. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's set our number per page to 1. So now we've got our 1 slide that's filling up the entire dimensions of our main content there. Now I'm going to turn off my global container and give my content sizing a max width. So you can see what's happening here is that we've got our slide, our currently active slide, taking up this central space that is being defined by our pink outline here. And we're getting that size because we've set our max width over here to 320 pixels. Now, while visually this looks very similar to our 3 slides per page option from earlier, you'll see that functionally they behave very differently, because as I go down to my medium breakpoint, for example, since this pink outline is where I'm getting my dimensions from, since the edges of the screen have not really encroached upon that sizing yet, it hasn't affected the look or feel of this slide. And you'll also see that because of that, the slides outside of my currently active slide here, they are just always going to be reflecting a very similar, very consistent size to my main slider here. And the cool thing about this is even down to my small breakpoint, things look really good. I've still got my slides moving here, and I haven't really needed to adjust this at all. Now, I might need to on a smaller breakpoint, and of course we could change those values responsively or set a different base value, but the thing to keep in mind there is that there are some really cool things you can do by not always using the global container here for your content sizing.